Alright, listen up. Deadlock just got a massive update. It's pretty much Deadlock 2.0 if it weren't, if it weren't still in development. Anyways, with that, yeah, completely new map. Calico has new animations, but be rest assured this guide is still relevant, still beautiful, still lovely. Put a lot of effort into it, so enjoy. Calico is one of Deadlock's 4 newest heroes, and almost everybody's saying that she sucks. Actually, scratch that. Shortly after writing this intro, Calico received some minor buffs, and more importantly, now that she's been out for longer than 2 seconds, people are actually starting to understand her kit, and, well, it's safe to say that in the right hands, Calico and Ava could be an absolute menace. Or should I say that they could be absolute menaces, since, there's Calico, and then there's Ava the cat. Anyways, emphasis on where I said in the right hands. One of the primary characteristics that initially drew me into maining Calico, and eventually cooking up this guide, was seeing just how skill expressive of a character she was. The steep learning curve, thanks to her janky and unintuitive abilities, made for a perfect balance of, oh my god, this is broken, and oh my god, this sucks. Ultimately, this feeling that her kit was a little bit inconsistent and underwhelming fed into my desire to master Calico. After my first day playing her, I thought to myself, if I could find a way to regularly one-shot enemies or regularly heal for half my health, there'd be no stopping me. So without further ado, welcome to my actually useful Calico guide, build included. Part 1, what does Calico do and what's her playstyle? The best way I can describe Calico is by saying that she's somewhere between an assassin and a bruiser. I don't think I really need to do any explaining as to what the term assassin means, but I'm assuming there are a lot of you who don't know what bruiser means, so let me explain. A bruiser is more or less a tanky character that excels in prolonged fights, kind of like Abrams and Shiv. The main difference between this and a tank is that a bruiser can actually pack a considerable punch, meaning that they can generally take care of themselves and even solo carry games. With that arbitrary definition now out of the way, what exactly makes Calico a blend between assassin and bruiser? In short, Calico thrives in aggressive up-close fights where she can capitalize on her short cooldowns, massive burst damage, and of course, ridiculous sustain. In the early and mid-game, I feel like Calico leans a little bit more towards the whole assassin thing, looking to burst your way into fights and ultimately be incredibly evasive with your ultimate and Ava. Once you start crossing over into the late game, Calico's bruiser identity comes to the forefront. With teams being more grouped up and everybody having both more tankiness and damage, it can be a little bit more difficult to pop somebody and get out alive. So unless you're super ahead, I'd recommend that in the late game you start beefing up a little bit and playing with your team. I'll go into more details about fighting as Calico and how to build her later on in this video, but for now, just know that if you like cheeky outplays or clutch moments, Calico's your girl. Part 2, abilities. As I mentioned previously, Calico's kit revolves around short cooldowns that are best used up close. Her first ability, Gloom Bomb, is a perfect example of this. Calico's one sends out a cluster of purple skulls that I may or may not have thought were cat poop for all of 5 seconds. Is she throwing cat poop? Oh god. I just had Calico ruined for me by somebody in chat, dude. I'm bummed. I'm actually so sad.
Oh, is she throwing cat
The
poop?
one is called Gloom Bombs, and if you look at it like... Oh, no, they're skulls. They're skulls. We're good. They're little skulls. No, it's not poop, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, LOL, dude.
I was like, oh my god, it's poop!
His entire day was about ruining.
Misunderstandings aside, these bombs deal a decent amount of damage, especially throughout the laning phase. Be warned though, as these bombs take a little bit of finesse to get maximum value out of. Unfortunately, Calico's bombs have a random spread pattern to them, which can definitely hurt their damage potential, but at the same time, after your first bomb is hit, any subsequent bomb only deals 50% damage, so it's technically not the worst thing ever, but you do want to be landing as many bombs as possible. How do you do that though if I said that the spread pattern is random? Bloom bomb tips. The first and most obvious solution to their sporadic nature is to be as close to the enemy as possible. After that, you'll want to make sure to aim a little bit lower on your enemies since the bombs have a tendency to go above your crosshair. The other major tip for making these gloom bombs a little bit more consistent is positioning. I've found that anytime I position myself above an enemy, I tend to land a lot more bombs. Could this be placebo? Yeah, definitely, for sure. But I will say that from a feeling perspective, this definitely makes a difference. In a lot of my one-shot clips, you'll see that I jump onto my enemies from height, and this is pretty much why. Moving on to Calico's second ability, Leaping Slash. As the name suggests, she leaps and she slashes. This ability deals a pretty decent chunk of physical damage, or gun damage, and it heals you for a very reasonable and not overtuned amount. To top it all off, its cooldown is only 10 seconds, and once you get to the tier 3 upgrade, it's only half of that, assuming you land the ability. Upon release, this ability used to heal you on troopers, jungle camps, and enemies, but unfortunately, that's no longer the case. As of me narrating this script, you only get healed when you hit an enemy. Bear in mind that the tier 3 upgrade does still work on troopers, objectives, and jungle camps. The only other thing worth mentioning about this ability is that it also counts as a light melee, so it'll work with items like Life Strike, Spirit Strike, and of course, scale with your melee damage. As much as I really like Calico's first ability, I would probably consider this her bread and butter, so it's important that you get comfortable with it. Much like her 1, I've heard people call this ability underwhelming and inconsistent, and a lot of that has to do with how it works without any tech. Basically, it's got a set range, making it surprisingly easy to whiff. If enemies are too close, you'll zip past them dealing 0 damage, healing for nothing, and it'll go on the full cooldown. If enemies are too far, well, pretty much the same thing happens. Initially, I too struggled with this ability a lot and found myself saying things like, make the initial dash do damage please, or let me cancel the dash early. But the more I use Leaping Slash, the more I feel like it's designed this way for a reason. Obviously, this ability is super strong, so in order to stay balanced, it needs to be difficult to use. Alright, so what was that tech that I mentioned earlier? Jumping. Jumping is the tech. Leaping Strikes tutorial time. If an enemy's barrel stuffing you, rendering your 2 useless, you're going to want to do 3 things. First, jump. After that, you can look down towards the ground, and finally, hit your 2. As you can see, now we can hit our slash on targets playing up in our face. I recommend that you get a feel for this in the sandbox because it definitely takes some getting used to, and there are some quirks. For example, looking too far down makes you go slightly up and to the right, which once again will make you whiff. Third-person shooter things, I guess. That being said, if you don't feel like learning the whole jumping tech, or just find it a little bit gimmicky or cheesy, another way to play around your 2's set range is with a little bit of dashing. Something that I still implement to this day is dashing backwards, canceling that dash with a slide, and then leaping back in towards my enemy. This will leave you with a similar results, but of course with the downside of using a stamina bar. I gotta say though, it looks pretty cool, so to me, that's worth. The last piece of advice I have for mastering Calico's Leaping Strikes is understanding how it interacts with ledges. Currently, anytime you're on flat ground, even if you're looking down a cliff or off a bridge, your 2 will be treated as if you were on flat ground, meaning you'll end up looking a lot like Wile E. Coyote. TLDR, jumping helps make your 2 a little bit more consistent, use it or don't. For our third ability, we're introduced to our beloved spectral cat, Ava. As somebody with a few naked cats at home and whose favorite color is purple, this ability is absolutely perfect. S tier visual design. Back to the ability though. Calico's 3 lets you turn into Ava. Doing so will give you a buff to your movement speed, take you off the minimap, and enables your ability to roam, gank, farm boxes, and last but not least, pull off cheeky escapes that otherwise wouldn't be possible. It's also worth noting that this ability's tier 3 upgrade acts as a mini fortitude. Between me and you though, I really don't ever make any use out of this because I upgrade this ability last. Ava's a pretty simple ability, so I really only have 3 tips here. Number 1, use her to gank since you're invisible on the minimap.
7 missing.
If anybody complains about what I just did to that man, just know that Hayes can do the exact same thing. That's all you gotta know. Invis dagger you, in lane, it's possible. I've seen it. Number 2, your actives work well in cat form, so who knows, maybe there's a use case for that. And number 3, don't be afraid to use this to escape. The combination of making your hitbox a little bit smaller and moving faster makes it a lot easier to get away. Do be warned though, as of narrating this, you do take a 30% movement slow whenever you get shot in Ava form, so it might just be better to run away normally, depending on the situation. And before anybody says, dude, did you know that Ava gives you your stamina back? No, they don't. Not anymore. They patched that out. I'm so sorry. Last but not least, Calico's 4, Return to Shadows. This ability gives Calico 3 seconds of invulnerability, a massive movement speed buff, and of course, damage. Lots of it. Upon reaching your tier 3 upgrade for it, it'll also refresh the cooldowns of your abilities and give you a thick 30% damage amp. Between this ability and your 2, you can turn certain death situations into absurd clutch outplays. All right. Oh no. It's a little bit of a bummer. Oh. Get on, dude. Oh my god, bro. Now you'd think since this ability is super strong, I'd have a lot of tips for it, but not really. It's kind of just straightforward. Option A, use it for damage. Option 2, use it to dodge stuff like Shiv ult, Wraith ult, or whatever else may come your way. The last thing we'll talk about before going into items is Calico's skill order. Personally, I like putting 1 point into my 2 right away so that I get a bigger heal. Hello, editing Ed here. That's no longer accurate actually, but good news. I will always have my skill order updated on my build page, and I think maybe I should go into a little bit of detail on what I upgrade, when I upgrade it, and why. In a world where Calico's spirit scaling gets buffed super hard, you could go super hard on the 1. If her healing gets nerfed or buffed, you could give or take points on the 2. But as of right now, I think Calico's best skill order is going to be 1 point into 1 so that you can proc Mystic Burst on it. Once I've done that, I'll put 2 points into my 2 and then 3 points into my ultimate. So what's the reason that I changed this? Basically, I want as much damage as possible, as quick as possible. Being able to survive longer, heal more, all that jazz is fantastic. Don't get me wrong, I love it. But in general, I think that in Deadlock, the faster you can close out a fight or the more damage you can bring to the table, the better. How do you build Calico and what items work well with her kit? First things first, Calico's default build page is terrible. Like, I'm sorry to whichever dev put this together, but dude, we gotta talk. Like, I am not exaggerating when I say you cooked so hard, you turned your kitchen into an Infernus cosplay. All jokes though. Okay, so I am gonna give you guys my build page so that you can follow that, but I think the best way to go about this is to actually make a tier list for the items that work well with Calico so that you guys have a better understanding of what works and why. S tier will consist of her core items that you more or less build every game. A tier will have items that I'd recommend most games. B tier will be a little bit more flexible, basically things that are nice to have. And lastly, C tier. For C, I've decided to include everything from upgrades, inefficient items that are easily replaced by others, and pretty much all luxury 4Ks that technically work with her kit, but I really would never buy unless you're in a 60-minute game. Also, I will not be adding situationals like Metal Skin, Unstoppable, etc., because these items are more or less built on everybody based on the game that you're in. S tier, Calico's best items. First up, we have Spirit Strike and Spirit Snatch. Spirit Strike is an incredible item for Calico as it's only 500 souls, and it'll give your 1 an extra 12% damage. On top of that, since your 2 counts as a light melee, it'll apply it. Same goes for Spirit Snatch, but only this time, instead of taking away 12% of the enemy's spirit resist, we're actually stealing that 12% spirit resist and giving it to ourselves, along with 26 spirit power. Next, we have Melee Lifesteal and Life Strike. These once again work in conjunction with your 2, only this time they apply a slow and heal you for even more. I already mentioned this prior, but I want to make sure that you get this clear. Any item that says it increases your melee damage will also increase your 2's damage. Moving on, Cold Front is going to be our third S tier item. Frankly, this item is just ridiculous. It's way too strong, and I expect this to be nerfed in the future, but I think it'll stay a staple for Calico. Staying on the topic of overloaded items, we have Healbane. At first, I didn't really think that this item was all that crazy for Calico, but the more I started playing with it, the more I realized just how good it is. Getting back a flat amount of HP anytime you get a kill makes clutch situations that much more likely, and of course, it helps you win 1v1 since it reduces their healing by 40%. Moving on to A tier, we have stuff like Mystic Burst since it procs with your tier 1/1, giving you extra burst damage in the early game, which can be pretty useful. After that, we have Ammo Scavenger because it gives you a decent bump in spirit power and, better yet, movement speed for ganking with Ava. We also have our beloved Berserker here because Calico thrives in extended fights. To help with Calico's lower fire rate and a little bit smaller magazine size, Kinetic Dash is up next. Also, let's not forget about the fact that it effectively gives you an extra bit of stamina. Next up, we're gonna have that beautiful Hunter's Aura. This will give you better 1v1s as it buffs your 2 damage since it gives a little bit of armor shred. After that, we have Ethereal Shift for even more invulnerability in fights. Also, the short-lived buffs that you get after the active are pretty nice too. Next up, we have Frenzy as it's one of the strongest items still, Colossus for the added tankiness and melee damage, Leech since, once again, Calico thrives in extended fights, and last but not least, a personal favorite of mine, Diviner's Kevlar for even more burst damage and tankiness. On to B tier. I'm not going to go super into detail anymore since I don't want to make this section of the video excessively long, but just know that in general these items help you a ton and will ultimately round out the rest of your kit. For B tier, we have Headshot Booster and Headhunter, which is actually the perfect segue for me to talk about Calico's gun real quick. Long story short, it shoots in a diamond pattern, which can be a little bit weird to play around with. At first, I was compensating by aiming at people's toes, but after further testing, I think it's best to aim where you want to hit them 99% of the time. The only instance in which this does not apply is at range. Moving on, close quarters and point blank, extra stamina and superior stamina, extra health and fortitude, Enchanter's Barrier, improved cooldown, Mystic Vulnerability, Bullet Resist Shredder, Heavy Melee Charge, Slowing Bullets, Soul Shredder Bullets, Torment Pulse, Debuff Remover. As for the C tier, I'll just pop it up on screen since I'm not going to read all these items out loud, but like I said earlier, it's pretty much just for late game upgrades and items that technically work, but are just inefficient. And here's my build ID for Calico. I think I've done a pretty decent job of explaining Calico's kit, what her playstyle is, and how to build her, so for the remainder of the video, we're going to be focusing on the more exciting stuff like her combos and gameplay. Calico's combos. Calico's combos are what's going to make or break this character for a lot of people, so it's important that you have them down. It might sound a little bit dramatic, quick, but the slower you act, the easier it's going to be to shut you down and prevent your full damage, which is why I'm putting so much emphasis on this. Combo number 1, your standard trading combo for the laning phase. 1 into 2 into melee. Alternatively, you can 2, melee, and then 1. I typically prefer the 1 into 2 into melee combo because it's a little bit more unpredictable and the burst of damage will come out faster. It's also worth noting that your Gloom Bombs have an activation time. This allows for you to travel with your 2 and activate Spirit Strike before your 1 actually goes off. If I prefer the 1-2 melee combo, then why did I mention the 2 melee 1 combo? Well, if there's a trooper wave between you and your enemy, or if you just want to guarantee you land as many bombs as possible, it's better to dash first. Be careful not to overdo your melee after your 2 because it does become a little bit predictable, and if you get parried in the early game, it's pretty much a death sentence. Combo number 2 comes online once you have Cold Front. For this one, you're going to want to 1-2 Cold Front melee. If you want to save your 1 for after your 2 again, feel free to do so. It's worth noting that this combo is for maximum damage, okay? Sometimes it's better to save the Cold Front to chase an enemy down instead of just dealing upfront burst, but that's a case-by-case thing that you'll just have to learn on your own. Combo number 3. This one is going to be your ultimate burst combo. 1 into 2 into 4. This combo will give you a massive burst of damage at the cost of no longer being able to use your ultimate as a safety net. Finally, combo number 4. 1 into 2 into Cold Front into 4. Bam! Now this is how you truly one-shot somebody. Can somebody clip that, please?
Oh. No, man. That's bad. I am so sorry.
Bro, what? Alternate combos do exist for Calico, but these require situational items such as Silence Glyph, which I rarely buy on Calico. The idea with something like Silence Glyph is you use it beforehand, so you would do something like Silence Glyph 1, 2, whatever. All in all, once you get a feeling for what works and what doesn't, just feel free to get creative. Now that you know how to consistently deal damage, we can move into the laning phase. Calico's early game is among the strongest in the game, even after the nerfs to her 2's healing. Her low cooldowns and burst damage make her incredibly oppressive, so we want to lean into that. I find that trying to land your 2 off cooldown on the enemy not only keeps you healthy, but keeps your enemies at low HP and scared, which is pretty cool. I will say though, against certain enemies such as Yamato that will often outtrade you using their 1, it might be better to save your 2 until after you take the damage. It's pretty easy to overlook the healing that your 2 does despite it being such a big part of your kit, but yeah, if you're full health and you trade into somebody with your 2 first, you're not going to have that to heal up during the fight itself, so be careful. Once I get my second skill point online, I like putting it into my 1 so that I can proc Mystic Burst with it. This allows you to start poking with your 1 for 100 plus damage every 10 seconds. In order to ensure maximum damage from your 1, make sure that Spirit Strike is procced on the enemy before sending out your bombs. Now, if you find yourself really liking your Gloom Bomb's damage with Mystic Burst, you can put 2 points into your 1 so that the Mystic Burst cooldown and Gloom Bomb cooldown line up. Okay, now before continuing with the laning phase tips, I do want to cover this. I didn't really know where to fit it in, so sorry that it's kind of abrupt and out of nowhere, but let's do a little math, get a little nerdy, and show you how good your 1 can be. Calico's 1 does 60 damage base, 80 once you have it at tier 1. That doesn't seem like a whole lot, especially once you remember that each bomb after the first does 50% damage less. Just because it doesn't sound like a lot though, doesn't mean that it isn't. 40 times 3, because you have 3 bombs after your first, is 120. 120 damage plus the initial 80, that's 200. Ouch. Now to make this go even crazier, factor in the -12 spirit resist that you'll have from landing your 2 or melee, and this gives you 224 plus Mystic Burst damage, which is 35, turned into 39 because of the -12 spirit resist, and oh my god, dude, you're literally taking away like half your enemy's health bar. It's so nasty. Back to the laning tips though. I touched on this a little bit before, but I'll do it again just so that we're clear. Chances are trading conditions won't be perfect while in the laning phase, so don't be afraid to spread your damage out in order to make it a little bit more consistent. Try to position yourself so that your 1 always lands towards the enemy and doesn't get stuck on troopers. This can mean either you dashing in to gap close a little bit, 2ing into the wave and just barely clipping your enemy, and then following up with your 1. However you decide to do it works just fine, but remember, in order to consistently land your 1, you're going to have to be up close with nothing between you and your enemy. One of the biggest rules that I try to follow with Calico's laning phase is to only fight when I have my 2 up. It's a pretty big source of your damage and it heals you a lot, so it's pretty important. Despite me saying that Calico has one of the strongest laning phases in the entire game, that doesn't mean that they're immune to counters. Enemies like Shiv, Infernus, Yamato, Warden, and Wraith all have kits that are pretty hard to play aggressively into. Infernus and Wraith in particular force you to respect them quite a bit. Flame Dash will keep you from aggressing too hard since you can't really escape it once he's used it, and then he's also got his explosive explosive combustion, which will lock you into a fight if you use your ultimate a little bit too early. If that happens, chances are you're a goner. Wraith and Shiv ultimates also force you to use your ultimate as a dodge tool, so in these matchups, I recommend that you hold off on your burst combo, leave your ultimate out of it, and save it to guarantee a kill or save it to guarantee your life. As for Yamato and Warden, try not to overcommit, don't engage with your 2, and save it until you actually need to heal. Feel like that was a little bit rambly, but hopefully I did okay. The only lanes that I would really consider impossible for Calico to win are against Grey Talon and Vindicta, since they just end up being a snooze fest, and yeah, no, I don't know, dude. They just kind of suck. It is what it is. Last but not least, Haze, Ivy, and Viscous are all very, very winnable lanes for Calico, but they do have consistent ways to dodge or shut down your combos. Lash in particular seemed like a surprising counter to Calico, and maybe it was just that game, but the way that he can leap over your leap is actually really impressive. Not to mention that his Flog can actually out-heal your leaping strikes, so I don't know, it's kind of tough. Going back to the Haze, Ivy, and Viscous thing, Haze can sleep dagger you right before you go in, Ivy can stone form the bombs and ultimately take away half your damage, and then Viscous can cube or ball. Either way, you kind of just end up being able to do nothing. As for items to watch out for that can counter you, keep an eye on the enemies building slowing hexes or decays. These two in particular really ruin your day. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, debuff remover, or at the very least, debuff reducer, is your friend. While on the topic of friends, don't forget to make use of your friend Ava and gank whenever possible. Calico's early game is super strong, so having a high impact in the first 5 to 10 minutes of a match can be pretty game changing. The last thing I'll say for Calico's laning phase is that a well-timed double jump can really shut you down. I've been doing this all week versus Ascendant and Eternus Calicos, and by the looks of it, it seems like a pretty strong and consistent way to deny half their damage and the entirety of their healing. If people start doing this regularly against Calico, things might start looking pretty rough, but for now, don't worry about it too much. Into the mid game. Once you've entered the mid game, it's time to start figuring out which build path you're going to use. Option 1 is to lean into Spirit with Diviner's Kevlar and Spirit Snatch. I typically like going this build against heavy Spirit teams, since Spirit Snatch will simultaneously debuff my enemies while buffing me. I also like to consider my teammates and whether or not they'll deal consistent damage or not, because a Spirit build is a little bit more bursty and ultimately won't thrive in prolonged fights. TLDR, if I have a Grey Talon Yamato pocket, chances are I'm better off leaning into a melee tank or gun bruiser build. Speaking of tanky builds, option 2, a melee tank build. For the tanky melee build, your main item is going to be Colossus, as it gives you a lot of resistances, a lot of health, and a lot of melee damage. Option 3, gun bruiser. For this one, your main item is going to be Frenzy. The bullet resist, gun damage, and high fire rate all go pretty crazy, so enjoy. Leech can be built on any of these 3 builds, but you just gotta figure out when to run it, but it is a little bit lower priority or more game specific, so I kinda just play it by ear and figure out when it feels right. Once you've figured out which build you want to use, it's time to abuse your 1v1 and 1v2 strength in order to split push. As long as you're consistently landing your 2, you should be able to stay up long enough to bleed your enemies out, if not eliminate them altogether. One of the primary benefits of splitting with Calico is the fact that it takes a while to take her out. Between your ultimates and vulnerability and your healing, it can be pretty overwhelming to deal with you, therefore a lot of teams will often send a lot of their players to come deal with you. If this happens, you're more or less giving your teammates permission to take a walker on the opposite side of the map. If split pushing isn't your thing, or you think team fighting is the better play for this game, I recommend that you use Ava and get active. Aim to push waves up as far as you safely can, clear nearby jungles, and join fights as they break out. If you have any more questions about the mid game or anything else in this guide really, feel free to pop into my stream and ask whatever question you have. Late game. Late game Calico is played entirely around her ability to engage, sustain, and stick onto the enemy carries. Anytime that you're in the mix, people will be forced to look at you quite similarly to something like a Yamato. But why should Calico engage? The primary reason I think Calico should be engaging for your team in late game fights is because she has one of the best AoE burst combos in the game. If you play your cards right, you often have the potential to end a fight before it really even starts. Even if you're not able to fully one-shot somebody, being able to delete 50-75% of 1 or 2 enemies' health bars can absolutely change the tide of a fight. And this is all without mentioning how safe it is to engage on Calico in the first place. Once you engage and pop your ult, you're invulnerable for 3 seconds, and if you really need more after that, you can use Ethereal Shift. I know it can be tempting to play further back and wait for somebody else to start the fight, but it's just way too consistent to engage on Calico. And like I said, there's very little downsides. In my opinion, there's really no better character to force enemy resources than Calico. To further prove my point, let's go ahead and make up a hypothetical. Let's say your Abrams jumps in to engage an enemy team Kelvin domes. What now? It's not like he can just disappear for 7 seconds. If only there was a character that could. Half-joking hypotheticals aside, the only exception for my engage first rule is if you have a Bebop, Holiday, Dynamo, or Paradox. Why fight a 6v6 if you can just turn it into a 5v6 instantly thanks to one of your pick characters? The only thing left for us to cover are some basic fighting tips, so let's go ahead and speedrun that. As I've mentioned probably 27 times now, Calico's strength lies in her low cooldowns, burst damage, and survivability. This means that proper spacing, disengaging, and re-engaging are really important skills to master in order to make the most out of your kit. Basic things like running around corners or through doorways in order to bait enemies into a more favorable fight is entirely what Calico's about. Ideally, playing into her strengths like this will lead you towards cheeky 1v2s and clutch plays, which obviously feel really good, but most importantly, it'll leave the enemy team scrambling trying to figure out whether or not they should send more people towards you and potentially lose a walker, or call the fight a loss and play for macro. With all that finally out of the way, where do I think Calico sits in the meta? Personally, I think she's fantastic. At the very least, an A-tier character with the potential to be nearly unstoppable in the right hands. I do somewhat worry that the player base will end up getting really good at reading when you're about to go in on Calico and, you know, do your spicy thing. But until then, only time will tell. All in all, I find Calico's kit super cohesive and fun to play. Her visual design is strong with a clear theme. She fills a niche and playstyle that Deadlock didn't really have before, and ultimately, I think that makes her an incredible addition to Deadlock's ever-growing cast. Thank you, Valve. Thank you, viewer. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.